Hello, I'm Dr. Jeff Kimmer. I graduated from the Warner School at the University of Rochester back in 2014. The presentation that I put together is purposely called a process rather than the process, since I am certain there are multiple ways to manage qualitative data. This may or may not work for you. Today's review is simply a straightforward approach to data collection and analysis, especially when you're looking at interviews and focus groups. Today, I would like to provide a high-level overview of transcription and coding. The purpose of this brief tutorial is twofold: to provide some basic fundamentals of coding, and to share an inexpensive but yet effective process that I found useful during my dissertation writing process. In fact, I still use this technique today while in my current job role as Chief Information Officer in the Pittsford Central School District when asked to conduct interviews and focus groups as part of my work. Think of today's tutorial as an investigation into three topics: information transcription, specific types of coding, and a high-level overview of data analysis. The thrust of this lecture is really about data collection. Allow me to quickly explain why. According to Rubin and Rubin, qualitative interviewing helps to reconstruct events that the researcher never experienced. In-depth interviewing helps portray ongoing social processes. It can capture change. This also allows the researcher, meaning you, to explore complex, contradictory, or counterintuitive matters. And it can help you research personal and sensitive matters or morally ambiguous choices that people have made. These are just a few reasons why you would want to embark upon this process. For a longer, more in-depth review, please indulge in a comprehensive qualitative methods course, or consult one of the books that I have referenced in this overview. Covey teaches us to start with the end in mind. We will be using Microsoft Excel for this demonstration. Excel is not a requirement. I use it since I have access to it, I am familiar with it, and I like it since it counts and sorts. You can use any program that you choose. I suppose you could use a word processor as a swap and forfeit counting and sorting, but that's up to you. Since this is not a review of Excel as a software program, nor is it about the technical setup of spreadsheets per se, and it's not a debate about spreadsheets versus tables, I hope you can reflect and think about what might work best for you and for your data collection. It's really all about you and your supervisor, not me. Think about methodology and categorizing themes for the sake of comparison. Please note the following that we will be reviewing as it relates to the slide in front of you: column headers for the different research questions, the questions versus the codes within the different columns, rows that represent data entry, colors that represent your stakeholder groups, and the tabs at the bottom of the workbook that represent each alternative that you might be seeking. Feel free to augment this as needed. Make it your own. And consider sharing any royalties with me if you profit from it. So far, this process has not turned out any dollars for me, but it has helped to organize the themes from my research and has helped writing become methodical, if not automatic. The process does help to make sense. Do you see what I did there? Cents versus dollars. It's my attempt at humor. Anyways, beyond humor, let's break down the process so that you can have a general overview. By now, you should have vetted and made clear your objectives and alternatives, no matter if it's for a dissertation or if it's for a research project of any kind. Your goal is to use research methods that will help you and your readers understand the effects for each of the established alternatives relative to your objectives. Let me say that again. Your goal is to use research methods that will help you and your readers understand the effects for each of your established alternatives relative to your objectives. When conducting quantitative and qualitative research, you are seeking to understand based on knowledge, context, and perception. Remember always to follow ethical procedures and RSRB protocols. Don't go off the approved script. Be consistent with your questions with on-point probing. Consistent questions will yield reliable feedback between interviews and focus groups. Interview and focus group discourse needs to be recorded and then transcribed. These days, a personal cell phone could serve this need for recording. I personally am the world's slowest typist, so I hired a transcriptionist. You may want to consider doing the same depending on your ability, your time, and your resources. Paying an accurate, efficient, skillful person may outweigh the opposite. Your decision. I have not found a program that'll change multiple voices into typed text with accuracy, although I'm sure it's on the horizon. You do need to monitor the transcripts, and you do need to generate memos to capture emerging and ongoing themes. That's the work of the researcher, not a transcriptionist. Summarized memos that stem from the transcription, that is, the data from the interviews and focus groups, will yield quotes, themes, and other information that may turn into coding for your qualitative research and may inform your decision-making process as it relates to your objectives and alternatives. So let's now talk a little bit about objectives and alternatives. This part of the process is very rote and automatic. First, you need to identify your objectives and then number them if you haven't done so already. Usually you will have between 6 and 10 objectives. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm not going to count all the way to 10, but you get the idea. It's usually 1 through 10, straightforward. Next, you'll assign letters to your alternatives. You will typically have 4 alternatives to keep the research reasonable. For example, A, B, C, and D. Not very exciting, straightforward, but absolutely necessary to keep your information and your themes and your writing straight. The next slide I provided here is simply an example from my past research that blends the numbered system along with the letters for the alternatives. I believe that all of you can count and that you know your ABCs, but good teaching requires starting off with clear models, so I wanted to show you an example from my doctoral work. First, you will see my objectives that are simply numbered. Next, you will see the alternatives that have been paired with a letter. Lastly, you will see that I have identified stakeholder groups using different font color that I concentrated on during my interviews and focus groups. This slide talks about RSRB protocols, which if you're not writing a dissertation and you're simply doing focus groups and interview type work as a researcher, it means you're going to establish consistent ethical rules that you're going to follow when interviewing. You're going to develop questions for all stakeholder groups while maintaining consistency per objective and per alternative. Ask minimal general knowledge questions. Ask the person or the group what they would support. So let's now review a template for the protocols using both the numbering and letter system that I spoke of earlier. These questions are related to the objectives that I was trying to better understand from my research. These were the objectives, left in black, shaded font, unlike those in color font that represented the stakeholder groups. You might have saw that on an earlier slide. Notice the alternatives using letters. Notice the objectives using numbers. I just want to drill that home because that's the pattern you're going to follow lockstep for those alternatives and objectives that you're trying to learn about. This next slide further extrapolates the objectives and the alternatives, specifically alternative C and alternative D. Again, trying to find very specific information, the effects of the objectives, in this case, objective 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6. Keeping in mind that my other objectives more or less called out the stakeholder groups that were important to my research at the time. Those were the items using color shaded font. So the process continued for alternatives C and D, similar to A and B. You need to continue through the logistics of setting up and implementing your qualitative measures. Remember to consistently ask your prepared questions and make sure you record all interviews and focus groups while taking notes. Here is an example of a protocol or a script. This example from my research paper illustrates a few points. First, probing through knowledge-based questions to build context. See the bold knowledge questions. Notice the repetition of questions per objective applied to each alternative. Lastly, the process is repeated for the appropriate objectives and is applied to all alternatives. Even though I mentioned it before, I'm going to say it probably the third time. Consistently ask your prepared questions, record that interview and or focus group while taking notes, read the transcription while looking for quotes and themes, and write your analytic memos so that you do not lose the details of the rich discourse, and then so that you can start to form your themes that you can write from. When I start tracking those themes, I like to use open coding, which I remember as being a flexible method for coding, and I'll leave it at that. From the reflective memos, you may want to start using second cycle coding, in other words, coding the codes. And from there, you will find your themes and trends among your codes. Let's review one of my transcription logs and review my takeaways from this example. Observe the layout. The header includes a time and date. Column headers. It's the raw data on the left from the transcription, and my notes are on the right, per question. Let's take a look at the rows. They represent questions and the anonymous responses. And lastly, the footer that includes the interview date and transcription date. So the procedure is really this. You have an interview, you have a focus group, someone's going to transcribe, you're going to take notes, you're going to write memos based on that activity and that data, and you're going to document data points into a spreadsheet by objective for each alternative for each question. Wrapping it all up in a package, I'd like to review the spreadsheet one more time, including the headers. Remember, the headers had very specific objectives that we were seeking to understand. Alongside, you'll find my initial open coding, which I again consider to be that open or general coding. You'll notice the rows. Those rows represent questions or each time there was data input. You'll also remember the colors, and you'll see a legend on the bottom of the screen. Those were the stakeholder groups I was trying to better understand on how their feelings and how their perceptions played into my objectives and alternatives. And lastly, the tabs. Each tab tracked back to an alternative per objective based on each stakeholder group. This slide represents coding, or at least the second cycle coding that I referred to earlier. If you were part of a qualitative methods course, or if you've recently consulted with a qualitative research methods book, this is where it'll pay dividends, and I'm just going to simply brush over it. Because you're really after data reduction or a data reduction process, not data elimination. But you're trying to take all those open codes and you're trying to pare them down to some kind of second coding that will minimize but not eliminate how many themes that you have found or uncovered. Second cycle coding can be represented by some of the items here using bullets. And I'm not going to read them all, but just a few examples. Pattern coding, focused coding, axial coding as just a few examples. And if you need to knock the rust off of that, as I said before, look at your qualitative method notes or crack open a book such as the coding manual for qualitative researchers. Those types of resources will give you the in-depth knowledge around second cycle coding that'll help with your final writing. As a reminder, this is a lesson on data collection, not coding, so please refer to your favorite qualitative methods guide for details. Analysis is important, especially when so much information can be placed in front of you vis-a-vis transcriptions and memos, so you really need to get to an analytical part of your writing. I like to make the analogy of your memos are more or less reflective journal entries. You're going to write some of them early on to find themes. You're going to write some of them later in your research to really hone in on what's going on. You're going to look for statements, quotes, and maybe even make note of further research that needs to be completed. These advanced memos, a little bit different than the earlier memos, are really going to help establish your final themes from the codes. You're going to identify beliefs and assumptions. These are the ones that you're going to compare using the different data categories in your spreadsheet. Here are some additional resources you may refer to, but I've also left some of the references in the footer of the slides while going through today's presentation. Really, today's presentation was about methodically arranging data so that you can enter it into a spreadsheet and simply track the themes and codes as time goes on. If you have any questions about this process, feel free to reach out to me using my personal email address or my work email address, and I'd be happy to answer any questions to the best of my ability or help you through your research and writing process.